Before we start, if you're finding these law enforcement stories interesting, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps the channel grow, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Now, let's get into what happened on Route 20 in Washington State. My name is Michael Vance. Before retiring in 2012, I worked for over 17 years as a Washington State trooper. People often ask me why I retired early. My usual answer is that I wanted to spend more time with my family and live a stress-free life. To a certain extent, that's true, but the real reason is something I can't tell anyone except my closest friends and family. It's about an incident that happened in October 1995 on a stretch of highway in the North Cascades, an incident that changed everything I thought I knew about the world. In 1995, I was stationed at the Marble Mount Detachment, and I was 32 years old. Marble Mount is a small town on State Route 20 that serves as the gateway to North Cascades National Park. If you've never used Route 20, it's one of America's most beautiful and dangerous highways. It cuts through the wildest wilderness of 48 states, winding through mountains and ancient forests, and you can drive for over an hour without seeing any other vehicle or sign of civilization. That was exactly what I loved about it. The solitude, the pure beauty of the Cascades. After growing up in Seattle, surrounded by concrete, chaos, traffic, and noise, patrolling Route 20 felt like being in paradise. Of course, there were downsides. The pay wasn't great, and the winters were brutal, but every shift brought breathtaking sights. Deer crossing the highway at dawn, eagles soaring over the Skagit River. Mountain peaks so sharp and white they seemed to slice through the sky. I'd been on night shift that October, working the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. rotation. It was a Tuesday, the 17th, and the weather had turned cold earlier than usual that year. The forecast was calling for the first snow of the season. In the higher elevations, traffic was light. Just a handful of logging trucks and the occasional RV heading back west after the summer tourist season. Around 1:30 a.m., I was parked at a pullout near milepost 126, finishing some paperwork and drinking coffee from my thermos, when the call came through. Unit 7, we have a report of an abandoned vehicle on Route 20 eastbound, approximately milepost 132. Caller states vehicle is running with lights on, driver's door open, no sign of occupants. I grabbed my radio. Unit 7, copy. Who's the caller? Logging truck driver heading west. He's pulled over on the opposite shoulder. Says the vehicle's been there at least 20 minutes based on when he passed it heading east. Unit 7 responding. ETA 10 minutes. I pulled out onto the highway and headed east, the road empty and dark except for my headlights cutting through the night. Milepost 132 was in a particularly remote section, surrounded by dense forest on both sides. No houses or businesses for miles. Whatever had happened there, the driver was on their own, until I arrived. I've responded to hundreds of abandoned vehicle calls over the years. Usually, it's simple. Mechanical breakdown, driver walking for help, or occasionally someone pulled over to relieve themselves and wandered a bit too far from the road. But something about this one felt wrong from the start. Maybe it was the time of night, or the remoteness of the location, or just cop instinct developed over years of patrol work. I spotted the logging truck first, pulled off on the westbound shoulder with hazards flashing. I could see the driver standing outside, a big guy in a flannel jacket, waving at me as I approached. I acknowledged him with a quick flash of my spotlight and continued past to the eastbound lane where I could see the abandoned vehicle. It was a late 1980s Subaru wagon, dark blue or black, hard to tell in the darkness. The engine was running, I could hear it idling and see exhaust vapor in my headlights. The driver's door was wide open, interior light on. The vehicle was positioned partially on the shoulder, partially in the right lane, at an angle that suggested it had pulled over quickly rather than parked deliberately. I called it into dispatch, giving them the plate number and situation description, then activated my dash cam and emergency lights. The logging truck driver had walked across the highway to meet me, and I could see he was genuinely concerned. "I passed this car heading the other direction about 25 minutes ago," he said. "When I came back this way, it was still here. Same position, engine running. I stopped to check. Called out, looked in the windows. Nobody. Keys in the ignition, wallet on the passenger seat, phone in the cup holder. But no driver. You touch anything?" "No, sir, just looked. Figured something was wrong and called you guys." "Good. You can head out if you need to. I'll take it from here." "You want me to stick around? Help you search?" I appreciated the offer, but protocol was protocol. "I've got backup coming. You go ahead." He nodded, gave me his name and number in case I needed a statement later, and headed back to his truck. I watched him pull away, his taillights disappearing around a curve, and suddenly I was very aware of how alone I was out here. I approached the Subaru carefully, flashlight in my left hand, right hand resting on my service weapon. "State Patrol, is anyone in the vehicle?" No response. I could see the interior clearly now. The driver's seat was adjusted for someone average height, maybe 5'10". The wallet on the passenger seat was open, showing a Washington driver's license. I angled my flashlight to read the name. Richard Allen Peterson, age 37, address in Bellingham. The phone in the cup holder was one of those new cellular phones, bulky and expensive. The fact that Peterson had left it behind told me this wasn't planned. Nobody abandons a $1,000 phone deliberately. I circled the vehicle, examining it for damage or signs of mechanical trouble. Nothing. No flat tires, no fluid leaks, engine running smoothly. Whatever had caused Peterson to exit the vehicle so urgently, it wasn't car trouble. I returned to my patrol car and ran the plate through dispatch. Vehicle came back registered to Richard Peterson at the Bellingham address. No wants or warrants. I requested they contact Bellingham PD for a welfare check and notify search and rescue that we might have a lost hiker. Then I grabbed my more powerful spotlight from the trunk and started searching the immediate area. The shoulder where the Subaru was parked was gravel and dirt, and I could see footprints leading from the driver's door toward the tree line. I followed them with my spotlight. They were clear prints, made by hiking boots, heading directly into the forest. No hesitation, no wandering. Whoever made them had walked with purpose straight into those trees. I grabbed my radio. "Unit 7 to dispatch. I have footprints leading from the vehicle into the forest on the north side of the highway. I'm going to follow them for preliminary search. Requesting ETA on backup." "Copy, Unit 7. Nearest unit is 45 minutes out. Search and rescue has been notified. Estimated response time 2 hours. 2 hours. That was the reality of working the remote highways. You were on your own for long periods, and by the time help arrived, situations could deteriorate significantly. I should have waited. That's what the manual said. Don't pursue alone, especially at night, especially in unknown terrain. But those footprints were fresh, and every minute I waited was a minute Richard Peterson was alone in the woods, possibly injured or disoriented. I made sure my radio was secured to my belt, checked that my flashlight had fresh batteries, and informed dispatch I was proceeding into the forest for initial search pattern. Then I stepped off the shoulder and into the trees. The transition was immediate and absolute. One moment, I was on the highway with the ambient light from my patrol car and the open sky above. The next moment, I was in near total darkness, surrounded by massive Douglas firs and western hemlocks that blocked out the stars. The only light was my flashlight beam, and even that seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. The footprints were easy to follow at first. The ground was soft with pine needles and moss, and the boot treads left clear impressions. Peterson had been moving quickly but not running. Taking a direct line deeper into the forest, I called out as I walked. Mr. Peterson, Richard Peterson, this is the State Patrol, can you hear me? My voice echoed strangely in the dense trees, and I heard nothing in response except the wind moving through the branches above. I'd been following the tracks for maybe 10 minutes. Had to be at least a quarter mile from the highway now, when I noticed something odd. The footprints were changing. At first, I thought I was imagining it. But when I knelt down and examined them more closely with my flashlight, there was no doubt the prints were becoming less distinct, the boot treads less clear, and they were getting larger. I'm not talking about slight expansion in soft soil. I'm talking about prints that had started at maybe size 10 or 11 boots now looking like size 15 or 16. And the tread pattern was fading, being replaced by what looked like bare feet. I stood up, my heart rate increasing. This didn't make sense. Had Peterson stopped to remove his boots? But why? It was October in the Cascades. The temperature was maybe 40 degrees. Nobody takes off their boots in these conditions. I kept following the tracks, and they kept changing. The boot prints disappeared completely, replaced entirely by bare footprints. But these weren't normal bare footprints. They were massive, at least 16 inches long and 7 inches wide. The toes were clearly defined, and the depth of the impression suggested something very heavy had made them. I stopped walking and stood there in the dark forest, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There are only a few things that can leave prints that size a bear can, but bear prints don't look like this. These were definitely foot-shaped, definitely bipedal. I'd heard the stories, of course. Every trooper who'd worked the North Cascades had heard them. Late-night radio chatter about strange sightings on Route 20. Logging truck drivers reporting massive shapes crossing the highway. Hikers coming out of the backcountry with stories about being followed by something that walked on 2 legs, but definitely wasn't human. Most of us laughed it off. Sasquatch stories were part of Pacific Northwest culture. Right up there with rain and coffee and flannel shirts. Some troopers took them seriously, claimed they'd seen things themselves, but I'd always assumed they were exaggerating, or misidentifying bears or elk in poor visibility. But I wasn't laughing now, because the evidence in front of me suggested that Richard Peterson had walked from his vehicle into these woods, and somewhere along the way his footprints had transformed into something else entirely. I grabbed my radio. Unit 7 to dispatch. Go ahead, Unit 7. I'm approximately quarter mile into the forest following tracks. Dispatch, I need you to note in the log that the tracks I'm following are unusual. They're showing characteristics inconsistent with human footprints. Size, shape, and pattern are anomalous. There was a pause on the other end. Copy that, Unit 7. Can you clarify anomalous? Negative, just noted in the log. I'm continuing pursuit. I didn't know what else to say. How do you tell dispatch you're following Bigfoot tracks without sounding insane? I kept moving, following those massive footprints deeper into the forest. The terrain was getting rougher now, heading upslope, the undergrowth thicker. I had to use my free hand to push through branches and ferns, and then I heard it. A vocalization. That's the only word I can use. It wasn't a sound I'd ever heard before. Not quite a howl, not quite a scream, not quite human. It was deep and resonant, echoing through the trees from somewhere ahead of me. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, then cut off abruptly. Every hair on my body stood up. My hand went to my service weapon. "Mr. Patterson," I called out, my voice sounding thin and weak compared to that vocalization. "Richard Peterson, if you can hear me, call out." Nothing. Just the wind and the distant sound of water running over rocks. I should have turned back, should have returned to my patrol car and waited for backup. That's what training dictated. That's what common sense screamed at me to do. But I thought about Richard Peterson, 37 years old from Bellingham, who'd abandoned his running vehicle with his wallet and phone inside and walked into these woods. Was he hurt? Confused? Running from something? Following something? I kept going. The footprints led me to a small clearing, maybe 30 feet across. In the center was a fallen log, massive and moss-covered, probably been down for decades. And sitting on that log, clear as day in my flashlight beam, was a boot I approached carefully, examining it without touching it. It was a hiking boot, size 11. Same tread pattern as the prints I'd been following at the beginning of my search. I scanned the area with my flashlight and found the second boot about 10 feet away. Richard Peterson had taken off his boots here and continued barefoot, but the tracks leading away from the clearing weren't the normal size 11 bare footprints you'd expect. They were those massive 16-inch prints. I stood there trying to process this impossible situation. A man had entered the forest, walked a quarter mile, stopped to remove his boots, and then either transformed into something else? Been joined by something else? Been carried by something else? None of the options made sense. I was about to radio for backup again when I heard movement in the trees ahead of me. Not the small movements of wind through branches or an animal in the undergrowth. Heavy movement. Something large displacing vegetation as it moved. "Mr. Peterson, is that you?" The movement stopped. For several long seconds there was absolute silence. I stood there with my flashlight, my breathing loud in my own ears, trying to see into the darkness beyond my light beam. Then I saw it. Just for a moment, at the very edge of my flashlight's range. A shape. Tall, very tall, at least 7 or 8 feet. Broad shoulders, arms that hung too long, and eyes. 2 eyes catching the light and reflecting it back at me. Not red like a deer or green like a cat, but amber, like embers in a dying fire. The shape moved, shifting position behind a large tree, not running away, not approaching, just watching me. My hand was on my gun, but I didn't draw it. Some instinct told me that would be the wrong move. Instead, I kept my flashlight pointed at the ground, not directly at the shape, and spoke calmly. "I'm looking for Richard Peterson. He left his vehicle on the highway. Is he with you? Is he safe?" I don't know why I asked if he was safe. I don't know why I dressed whatever was out there, as if it could understand me. But in that moment, standing alone in the dark forest with something massive and unknown watching me from the trees, it felt like the right thing to do. The shape moved again, and I heard that vocalization again. But this time it was different, quieter, almost conversational. It lasted 3 or 4 seconds, a series of low sounds that had a rhythm to them, almost like speech, and then, from somewhere deeper in the forest, I heard a response. Another vocalization, higher pitched, more complex, and then another from a different direction. I wasn't dealing with one creature. There were multiple. My radio crackled, making me jump. "Unit 7, what's your status? We've lost your location signal. Are you all right?" I grabbed my radio, still keeping my eyes on the darkness ahead. "Unit 7, I'm okay. I'm in the forest approximately half-mile north of the abandoned vehicle. I've found evidence that the missing person may not be alone. Requesting immediate backup and search and rescue priority response." "Copy that, Unit 7. First backup unit, ETA 25 minutes. Do you need to withdraw to your vehicle?" I looked at the shape in the darkness. It hadn't moved closer, hadn't shown any aggression. The vocalizations had stopped. There was a strange quality to the silence now, like whatever was out there was waiting to see what I would do. "Negative, dispatch. I'm holding position. We'll update in 10 minutes if situation changes." I clipped the radio back to my belt and took a slow breath. "Mr. Peterson," I called out again, "if you're out here, I need you to let me know. Your family is worried about you. I'm here to help." Nothing for a long moment. Then, from the darkness ahead, a voice, human voice, male, calm. "I'm here, officer. I'm safe. You should go back." Mr. Peterson, Richard Peterson, yes. I need you to come out where I can see you, sir. I can't do that, not yet. You need to go back to your car and tell them you couldn't find me. Tell them to call off the search. I can't do that, Mr. Peterson. You abandoned your vehicle on a state highway. We need to verify you're unharmed and understand what happened. There was a pause, and I heard low voices conferring in the darkness. Not vocalizations this time, but actual whispered human speech, though I couldn't make out the words. Then Peterson spoke again. Officer, I'm going to come out, but you need to stay calm. You need to trust me when I say that nobody here is going to hurt you. Can you do that? Yes, I said, though my hand stayed near my weapon. Shine your light on the ground in front of you. Don't point it directly at us. That would be uncomfortable for everyone. Us, not me. Us. I angled my flashlight downward, illuminating the forest floor but not shining directly ahead. And then Richard Peterson walked into the light. He was exactly as his driver's license described. 5'10", average build, brown hair, mid-30s. He wore jeans and a fleece jacket, and his feet were bare and dirty but didn't appear injured. He had his hands raised in a peaceful gesture, and his expression was calm but serious. Officer Vance, he said, reading my name tag. I know this looks bad. I know you have questions. But you have to listen to me very carefully. What you do in the next few minutes is going to determine whether something wonderful happens or whether something terrible happens. Mr. Peterson, are you in danger? Are you being held against your will? No. God, no. It's the opposite. He struggled for words. I was driving from Bellingham to Winthrop business trip. I've driven this road dozens of times. But tonight, about milepost 132, I saw something in the road. Massive. Standing upright, looking right at my car. I stopped before I hit it, and it just stood there, staring at me through my windshield. What was it? You know what it was, officer. You followed the tracks. You know. Behind him, still hidden in the darkness but visible as massive shapes in my peripheral vision, I could see them. Multiple figures standing motionless among the trees. Watching. How many are there? I asked quietly. 4. A family. 2 adults, 2 young ones. They're not going to hurt anyone. They're trying to tell us something. Tell us what? Richard Peterson looked at me with an intensity that made it clear he believed every word he was about to say. The forest is dying, officer. Not obviously, not in ways we'd notice, but they notice. They've been here for thousands of years, and they can feel it. Something's wrong. Something's coming, and they showed me. They took me up the slope and showed me the trees, showed me the signs. There's going to be a fire, a bad one, and soon. I stared at him. Mr. Peterson, have you hit your head? Are you disoriented? I'm completely lucid. I know how this sounds, but I'm asking you, trooper to citizen, trust your instincts. You felt something in these woods tonight. Something you can't explain. You saw them, and you know deep down that I'm telling the truth. The shapes in the darkness shifted slightly, and I heard one of the vocalizations again. Quiet, almost gentle. Richard turned toward them, made a gesture with his hands, and turned back to me. They're asking me to ask you to leave, to go back to your car and report that you couldn't find me, that the search was unsuccessful. They don't want more people coming into the forest, more noise, more attention. And what are you going to do? I'm going to stay with them for a few days. They're going to show me more. Help me understand what needs to happen, and then I'll come back. I'll turn myself in, file a missing person report closure, whatever needs to happen. But Officer Vance, I'm asking you to give us time, please. This was the moment. The moment where I had to make a decision that would define everything that came after. I could arrest Richard Peterson right now, bring him out of the forest and turn this into a circus. Search and rescue would flood these woods. Maybe someone would get footage of these creatures. Maybe they'd disappear and never be seen again. Maybe someone would get hurt. Or I could trust my instincts. Trust that Richard Peterson, a man I'd just met, was telling me some version of the truth. Trust that what I'd seen in these woods wasn't a threat, but something else entirely. I looked at Richard Peterson, at his earnest face and dirty bare feet. I looked at the shapes in the darkness, those massive amber eyes watching me with what I could only describe as intelligence and caution. And I made my choice. How long do you need? Relief flooded Peterson's face. 3 days, maybe 4. I'll come out to my car. If it's been towed, I'll come to the Marble Mount detachment, I promise. And if you don't? Then you can tell everyone everything, but I will. You have my word. I nodded slowly. I'm going to report that I followed tracks for approximately 1 mile but lost them in rocky terrain. I'm going to recommend continued search tomorrow at first light. Thank you. Thank you so much. But Mr. Peterson, understand something. If anything happens to you, if you get hurt or don't come back, I'm going to have to live with that decision for the rest of my life. Don't make me regret this. You won't, I promise. I took one last look at the shapes in the darkness, then turned and began walking back toward the highway. My flashlight beam bounced with each step, and I could feel their eyes on my back the whole way. When I finally emerged from the tree line and saw my patrol car with its lights still flashing, I felt like I'd been gone for hours instead of maybe 90 minutes. The Subaru was still there, engine running, door open, exactly as I'd found it. I got in my patrol car and sat there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Then I grabbed my radio. Unit 7 to dispatch. Go ahead, Unit 7. I've completed initial search pattern, followed tracks approximately 1 mile into forest but lost them in rocky terrain. Subject's footwear appears to have been compromised. Tracks became inconsistent. Unable to locate subject. Recommend continued search at first light with full search and rescue deployment. Copy that, Unit 7. Are you returning to station? Negative. I'm going to secure the vehicle and wait here for the tow truck. We'll file full report at end of shift. 10-4, Unit 7. I sat there by the side of Route 20, watching the eastern sky slowly begin to lighten with the approaching dawn. The Subaru's engine ran steadily, and somewhere in the forest behind me, Richard Peterson was with creatures that shouldn't exist, learning things that might save lives if he was telling the truth about the fire. Or he was a delusional man who'd had a psychotic break and wandered into the woods with wild animals that would kill him before morning. Either way, I'd made my choice, and I'd have to live with whatever came next. The sun rose over the Cascades, painting the mountains gold and pink, and I sat there wondering if I'd just become part of something extraordinary or if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my career. 3 days, I'd given him 3 days. I hoped to God he'd come back. The next 3 days were among the longest of my life. I filed my report exactly as I'd told dispatch, documenting the abandoned vehicle, the tracks I'd followed, the loss of trail in rocky terrain. The Subaru was towed to the impound lot in Marble Mount. Search and rescue deployed at first light the next morning with dogs and a helicopter, but they found nothing. Richard Peterson's name went into the missing persons database. His wife, Carol, was contacted in Bellingham. She was distraught, couldn't understand why her husband would abandon his car and walk into the wilderness. He'd been on a routine business trip to Winthrop, planning to return home the next day. No history of mental illness, no suicidal ideation, no reason to disappear. I visited her on day 2, my day off, driving the hour and a half to Bellingham. It was the least I could do, given what I knew and wasn't saying. She met me at her door, eyes red from crying. holding a photo of Richard like it was a lifeline. "Please, tell me you're going to find him," she said. "Please tell me he's okay." I wanted to tell her everything. Wanted to explain that her husband was safe, that he'd made a choice to stay in the woods for reasons that might save lives, but I couldn't. Not yet. "We're doing everything we can, Mrs. Peterson. The search is ongoing. We have every reason to believe he's still out there and that we'll find him. But why would he leave his car? Why would he just walk into the forest like that? It doesn't make any sense. Sometimes people experience disorientation or confusion, especially late at night on unfamiliar roads. He may have thought he saw something, went to investigate and got turned around. It happens more often than you'd think." She wanted to believe me. I could see it in her face. But she also knew her husband, and she knew something wasn't right about the official story. "If he comes back," she said quietly, "if you find him alive, will you tell him something for me?" "Of course. Tell him that whatever happened, whatever he did or saw or thought he saw, I just want him home. Tell him we can work through anything. I just need him to come home." I promised I would, and I left her there in her doorway, holding that photograph, waiting for news that I hoped would come in less than 24 hours. Day 3 came and went. No Richard Peterson, no sign of him at the abandoned Subaru location, no appearance at the Marble Mount detachment. I started to panic. Had I made a terrible mistake? Had I let a man walk to his death because I'd been too shocked by what I'd seen to think clearly? I drove out to milepost 132 that evening after my shift, parked where the Subaru had been, and walked into the forest with my flashlight. I followed the same path I'd taken 3 nights earlier, calling out for Peterson, looking for any sign that he or the creatures were still in the area. Nothing. The forest was silent, except for the wind and the distant sound of the Skagit River. The boots were gone from the clearing. The massive footprints had been washed away by rain that had fallen the previous day. I stood there in the darkness, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing, wondering if stress and too many night shifts had made me see things that weren't there. But no, I'd seen him. I'd talked to him. Richard Peterson had been real, and so had the massive shapes in the darkness behind him. On the morning of day 4, I was at the detachment filling out paperwork when the call came through. "All units, we have a report of a male subject walking on Route 20 near milepost 132. Appears disoriented, possibly injured. Subject matches description of missing person Richard Peterson. Unit 7, you're closest." My heart jumped. Unit 7 responding ETA 5 minutes. I was there in 4, lights and sirens, adrenaline pumping. And there he was walking slowly along the shoulder of the highway, barefoot and dirty, but upright and alive. I pulled over ahead of him and got out. "Mr. Peterson!" He turned to face me, and I saw that he'd been crying. Not from pain or fear, but from something else, something deeper. His feet were cut and bruised, his clothes were torn and muddy, but his eyes were clear and focused. "Officer Vance," he said, relief evident in his voice. I kept my promise. I approached him carefully. "Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "My feet are pretty beat up, but otherwise I'm okay. Physically, anyway." He looked back toward the forest. "Emotionally, I don't think I'll ever be the same." I called for medical response and sat him down on the guardrail. Other units were responding. Search and rescue had been notified, and soon this area would be swarming with people asking questions. We only had a few minutes alone. "Did you see what you needed to see?" I asked quietly. He nodded. "I saw everything. Officer Vance, they're not animals. They're not monsters. They're people. Different, but people. They have language, culture, family bonds. They've been here for thousands of years, watching us, avoiding us, protecting the forest, and they're terrified. Of what? Of what's coming. They took me up to the ridge, showed me the trees. There's a beetle infestation, bark beetles, spreading through the forest faster than anyone realizes. The trees are dying from the inside out. And when the summer heat comes, when the conditions are right, this whole area is going to be a tinderbox. They can sense it. They've lived through fires before, but never like what's coming. When? They can't give me exact dates. They don't think about time the way we do. But sometime in the next year or two. And it's going to be catastrophic. The families that live in these woods, they're trying to decide whether to leave, to migrate north to Canada where the forests are healthier. But they've been here for generations. This is their home. Before I could ask more questions, the ambulance arrived, followed by 2 more patrol units. Suddenly, we were surrounded by paramedics and officers and questions. Richard was loaded into the ambulance for evaluation, and I had to step back and let the investigation run its course. The official story that emerged over the next few hours was that Richard Peterson had pulled over thinking he had a flat tire, exited his vehicle to check, and became disoriented when he wandered too far from the road. He'd spent 3 days lost in the woods, surviving on stream water and berries, before finally finding his way back to the highway. It was a plausible enough story. People bought it. Search and Rescue congratulated themselves on a successful outcome. Carol Peterson drove from Bellingham to pick up her husband from the hospital, crying and hugging him and thanking everyone who'd looked for him. But I saw Richard's eyes when he told that story to the other officers. I saw the weight of the lie, the truth he was carrying that he couldn't share, and I saw him look at me over Carol's shoulder, a look that said, "Thank you. Thank you for believing me. Thank you for giving me time." 2 days later, Richard Peterson came to the detachment. He said he wanted to thank me personally for my search efforts, wanted to retrieve his personal effects from the impounded Subaru. We sat in the small interview room, ostensibly so he could file some final paperwork, but really so we could talk privately. "They gave me something," he said, pulling out a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "Before I left, they drew this." He unfolded the paper on the table between us. It was crude but clear, a map of the North Cascades area around Route 20. Circles marked specific locations, with marks that I interpreted as intensity or priority. One large circle encompassed an area about 10 miles east of where we'd first met, in the heart of some of the densest old-growth forest in the region. "This is where the fire will start," Richard said, pointing to the largest circle. "They don't know exactly when, but they know where. The beetle infestation is worst here. When the conditions are right, all it will take is one lightning strike, one careless campfire, one spark, and it will explode." "Did they tell you what they want us to do with this information?" "They want you to watch to be ready. When the fire comes, it will spread fast. There are homes in the valleys below these mountains, people. They want you to be prepared so you can save them." "Why tell us at all? If they're so good at avoiding humans, why risk revealing themselves?" Richard met my eyes. "Because, despite everything we've done to them, despite being hunted and feared and disbelieved, they still care about us. They still see us as part of the forest, part of the ecosystem they protect. And they're hoping that maybe, if we survive what's coming, we'll finally learn to see them the same way." He left the map with me. That simple drawing that might have been a child's doodle, or might have been a warning from creatures that had lived in these mountains since before humans arrived. I didn't know what to do with it. I couldn't show it to anyone without explaining where it came from. I couldn't file it as evidence because there was no crime to investigate. So I kept it, folded it up, and put it in my locker at the detachment. and I tried to go back to my normal routine of patrolling Route 20 and filing reports and drinking coffee at pullouts while watching the sun rise over the Cascades. But I couldn't stop thinking about what Richard had told me. I couldn't stop looking at those mountains and wondering what was happening beneath the canopy, what those creatures were sensing that we couldn't see. 3 months later, in January of 1996, I requested a meeting with the District Forest Service supervisor. I told him I'd been noticing signs of increased bark beetle activity during my patrols, that some of the trees visible from the highway looked stressed. I suggested they might want to do a comprehensive survey of the forest health in the Route 20 corridor. He thanked me for my vigilance, but explained that bark beetle surveys were resource-intensive and they had no budget for additional studies. Besides, beetle infestations were a natural part of forest ecology. Unless there was visible widespread die-off, they weren't going to take action. I tried to push harder, suggested that maybe this was different, that maybe the scope was larger than they realized. But he dismissed my concerns with a patient smile and a reminder that I was a trooper, not a forestry expert. I walked out of that meeting feeling helpless. I had information that could save lives, but it came from a source I could never reveal. The map in my locker might as well have been written in invisible ink for all the good it could do. Over the next year, I watched those mountains carefully. I noted every patch of brown needles, every tree that looked sick, every sign that the forest was under stress. And I wasn't the only one. In April of 1996, I responded to another abandoned vehicle call. Different location, different circumstances, but when I arrived, I found a vehicle pulled over with the driver standing on the shoulder, pointing into the forest with a look of awe on her face. "Did you see them?" she asked when I approached. "Tell me you saw them. Tell me I'm not crazy." "Ma'am, what did you see?" I was driving, and something ran across the road, something huge, on 2 legs, like a person, but not a person. It looked right at me before it went into the trees, and I swear to God it had intelligence in its eyes. And then I saw 2 more, smaller ones, following behind it. A family. I saw a family of Sasquatch cross this highway, officer, and I need you to tell me I'm not losing my mind. I looked where she was pointing, and there, clear as day in the soft mud at the forest edge, were footprints. Massive, unmistakable, leading into the trees. "Ma'am," I said carefully, "I believe you saw something unusual, but I need you to understand that if you report this as a Sasquatch sighting, you're going to get a lot of attention. News media, cryptozoologists, tourists. Is that what you want?" She thought about it, staring at those footprints. "No," she said finally. "No, I don't want that. I just wanted someone else to know they're real, that I wasn't hallucinating." "They're real," I said quietly, "and they deserve to be left alone." She nodded, got back in her car and drove away. And I stood there looking at those footprints, wondering how many other troopers and drivers and hikers had seen things in these mountains and chosen to stay silent, to protect creatures that most of the world didn't believe existed. That summer was hot. Unusually hot. The snowpack melted early, and by July the forests were tinder dry. Fire danger was rated extreme across the Cascades. And I kept thinking about that map, about those circles marking the places where the fire would start. In August, I pulled my shift supervisor aside and told him I had a bad feeling about the fire season, that my instincts were telling me we needed to have evacuation plans ready for the communities near Route 20. He appreciated my concern, but reminded me that fire services handled wildfire response, not state patrol. "If something happens, we'll respond," he said. "But we can't start evacuating people based on a feeling, Mike." I knew he was right. I also knew that when the fire came, my feeling wouldn't matter. The map wouldn't matter. All that would matter was whether we could get people out fast enough. On August 14th, 1996, a dry lightning storm moved through the North Cascades. I was on shift, monitoring the weather reports, watching the radar, knowing in my gut that this was it. This was the moment Richard and those creatures had warned me about. The first fire reports came in around 10 p.m. Multiple strikes in the mountains east of Marble Mount. Small fires, easily contained, according to initial reports, but by midnight the wind had picked up, and those small fires had merged into something larger. By 2 a.m., the fire was racing through the mountains, driven by 50-mile-per-hour winds through beetle-killed trees that exploded like gasoline-soaked torches. And the center of the fire, the point of origin, where the lightning had struck and the flames had found perfect conditions, was exactly where Richard's map had marked. With the largest circle, I pulled the map out of my locker and stared at it in the dim light of the detachment. They had known. Somehow, they had known exactly where and roughly when the fire would start, and they had tried to warn us. But it was too late for that knowledge to help prevent the fire. All we could do now was try to save people from it. The next 48 hours were chaos. Evacuations were ordered for communities in the fire's path. Route 20 was closed. Hundreds of firefighters poured into the area trying to establish containment lines, and I spent every waking moment helping coordinate evacuations, directing traffic, setting up roadblocks. The fire burned for 3 weeks, consuming over 40,000 acres of pristine Cascade Forest buildings were lost, but miraculously no lives. The evacuation had been fast enough, the response coordinated enough that everyone got out. But I kept thinking about the other evacuees, the ones no one was talking about. The families that had lived in those forests for thousands of years, who had tried to warn us, who had given us a map and a message and a chance to prepare. Had they survived? Had they fled north as they'd planned? Had Richard's map helped at all, even indirectly, by making me more vigilant, more prepared to push for evacuation? I didn't have answers. All I had was the map, now smoke-stained and worn, that I kept folded in my wallet as a reminder of what I'd seen and what I'd learned. 3 months after the fire, Richard Peterson contacted me. We met at a small diner in Concrete, far enough from Marble Mount that no one would recognize either of us. "They survived," he said as soon as we sat down. "I wanted you to know, they moved north before the fire hit, crossed into Canada. They lost their territory, their home, but the families survived." "How do you know?" "They found me, came to my house in Bellingham 3 nights ago, tapped on my bedroom window like we'd arranged a meeting. They wanted to thank you for trying to warn people, for taking their message seriously, even when you couldn't reveal where it came from." "I didn't do enough. I should have pushed harder. I should have found a way to make people listen." "You did what you could with impossible information. They understand that, and they want you to know something else. They're not coming back to this area. The forest will regrow, but it will take decades, maybe centuries. So, if you keep patrolling Route 20, you probably won't see them again. But they'll remember you. And if you ever need them, if you ever face something you can't handle, find a way to get into those mountains. Call out. They'll be listening." We sat in that diner for another hour, 2 men who'd shared an impossible experience, trying to make sense of it. Richard told me he'd changed careers, was now working with environmental nonprofits, trying to protect forests without being able to explain his real motivation. I told him I was thinking about retiring early, that the job had changed for me after that night at milepost 132. When we parted ways, I knew I'd probably never see him again. His life had taken him in one direction, mine in another. But we were bound together by what we'd witnessed, by the secret we carried, by the knowledge that the forests held more mystery and wonder than most people would ever imagine. I stayed with the State Patrol for another 5 years before I finally retired in 2001. I never saw them again. Those massive figures in the darkness, those amber eyes watching from the trees. But I felt their presence sometimes when I patrolled Route 20 late at night. A sense of being watched but not threatened, protected, maybe, and every time I passed milepost 132, I thought about that night. About Richard Peterson calmly walking into the forest. About making the choice to trust my instincts over protocol. About creatures that shouldn't exist but did, living in the shadows. Watching over forests that most humans saw as just resources to be logged or parks to be visited. I kept the map. It's in a safe deposit box now, along with a written account of everything that happened. Maybe, someday, when I'm gone, someone will find it and wonder if it was real, or if it was just a crazy story from a burned-out trooper who worked too many night shifts. But I'll know. And Richard will know. And somewhere in the forests of British Columbia, a family of creatures that have survived for thousands of years will know they're real. They're intelligent. And they care about the forests they protect. And sometimes, when the stakes are high enough, they'll trust a human to help them. I was that human once. And I've spent the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that trust. The story should have ended there. Richard Peterson returned to his life. I continued my patrols, and the secret we shared remained buried. But the truth about the North Cascades forest, about the creatures that lived there, had a way of refusing to stay hidden. It started 6 months after the fire. In February of 1997, I was working a day shift for once. Unusual for me, but we were short-staffed. The snow was deep that winter, deeper than it had been in years, and Route 20 was down to one lane in places where the plows couldn't quite clear the full width. I was parked at a pullout near Diablo Lake, filling out paperwork, when I saw him. A man walking along the shoulder of the highway, no vehicle nearby, wearing inadequate clothing for the weather. Not Richard Peterson. Someone else. Someone I didn't recognize. I pulled up alongside him and rolled down my window. "Sir, do you need assistance?" He turned to look at me, and I saw immediately that something was wrong. His eyes were vacant, his movements mechanical. He wore jeans and a light jacket, no hat, no gloves. His hands were blue with cold. "Sir, you need to get in the patrol car. You're suffering from exposure." He didn't respond, just kept walking. I got out and approached him, and that's when I saw his feet. He wasn't wearing boots. He wasn't wearing shoes at all, just socks, frozen stiff, leaving bloody footprints in the snow. "Sir, stop walking. You're going to lose your feet to frostbite. I need you to get in my car right now." Still no response. I grabbed his arm, and he finally stopped. He turned to face me with those empty eyes, and then he spoke. Not in English, not in any language I recognized. A series of low vocalizations, rhythmic and structured. The same sounds I'd heard that night in the forest at milepost 132. My blood went cold, and not from the weather. "Where did you learn that?" I asked quietly. "Who taught you those sounds?" He blinked, and suddenly there was recognition in his eyes, as if he'd just woken up from sleepwalking. He looked down at his frozen feet, at his inadequate clothing, at the snow all around us, and terror filled his face. "Where am I? How did I get here?" I got him into the patrol car, cranked up the heat, called for medical response. His name was David Lale, a software engineer from Seattle on a camping trip. Except he'd gone camping in August, over 5 months ago. The last thing he remembered was setting up his tent near Thunder Creek, about 15 miles from where I'd found him. "I remember going to sleep in my tent," he said, his voice shaking as the paramedics worked on his feet, and then dreams. Strange dreams. Walking through forests, following lights, hearing voices that weren't quite voices. And then I was here, on this highway, and you were talking to me. The hospital kept him for 3 days, treating severe frostbite and hypothermia. I visited him on day 2, after his family had been contacted and the initial shock had worn off. "Mr. Leo, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think very carefully before you answer. In those dreams you mentioned, did you see anything? Anyone?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his bandaged hands. "I saw them," he said finally. "I know I did. I know it sounds crazy, but in the dreams, there were these people, huge people, and they were trying to tell me something, show me something, but I couldn't understand. Did they hurt you?" "No, God, no. They were gentle, almost protective. But I think they kept me somewhere, kept me safe through the winter, fed me, gave me water. I have memories of being in a cave, warm despite the cold outside, and they were there, watching me, bringing me things. Why would they do that? I don't know, but Officer Vance, there's something else, something I haven't told anyone, not even my family. When I was with them, when I was in whatever that dream state was, they showed me things, future things, disasters, fires and floods and earthquakes, like they could see time differently than we do, like they were trying to warn me about what's coming. I thought about Richard's map, about the fire that had burned exactly where the creatures had predicted. Did they show you anything specific? Anything with dates or locations? "Mount Rainier," he said quietly. "They kept showing me Mount Rainier and Seattle. And water. So much water. They kept drawing in the dirt, making symbols. I tried to remember them, tried to understand. But, officer, I'm not a geologist or a seismologist. I don't know what it means." Over the next 2 weeks, I looked into David Lael's disappearance. His campsite had been found abandoned in August. His tent and gear still there, but no sign of him. Search and rescue had combed the area for days and found nothing. He'd been declared missing, presumed dead in a wilderness accident. And now he'd reappeared, 5 months later, 15 miles from his campsite, with memories of being cared for by creatures that shouldn't exist and warnings about disasters that hadn't happened yet. The official explanation was that Lyle had suffered some kind of mental break, had wandered away from his campsite and survived the winter in a dissociative fugue state, his mind protecting itself from the trauma by creating elaborate fantasies, but I knew better. I'd heard those vocalizations. I'd seen the intelligence in their eyes. And now I had 2 witnesses, 2 men who'd encountered them and returned with the same message. They're trying to warn us. I started keeping a file. Nothing official, nothing I could ever submit as evidence. Just a personal record of incidents along Route 20 that didn't quite make sense. Hikers who disappeared and reappeared months later with gaps in their memory. Reports of massive footprints found in impossible locations. Drivers who claimed to see huge figures crossing the highway at night. Most people dismiss these stories. Sasquatch sightings were common in the Pacific Northwest. So common they'd become a joke, a tourist attraction, something to sell t-shirts about. But when you looked at the pattern, when you saw how many of the witnesses came back with the same message about warnings and disasters, it became harder to dismiss. In May of 1997, I was contacted by someone unexpected. A federal agent, FBI, named Kristen Martinez. She called the detachment and asked to meet with me privately, away from the office. We met at a trailhead parking lot near New Hallam, just the 2 of us. "Officer Vance," she said, showing me her credentials. "I'm part of a division that investigates unusual incidents in federal wilderness areas. My supervisor thinks I'm wasting time and resources, but I've been following a pattern for the past 3 years. Disappearances in national forests across Washington and Oregon, followed by reappearances months later. The witnesses all tell similar stories, and your name has come up in several reports. How so? You responded to both the Richard Peterson incident and the David Lale incident. Two men who disappeared into the wilderness and came back with stories about mysterious benefactors. That's a statistical anomaly worth investigating. I chose my words carefully. What do you think is happening to these people? Honestly, I don't know. But I think something is out there. Something intelligent. Something that's been living in these forests for a very long time, and I think it's trying to communicate with us. She pulled out a folder and showed me photographs, maps of the Pacific Northwest with red dots marking disappearance locations, copies of reports from witnesses describing creatures matching the classic Sasquatch description. And then, most startling, photographs of footprints, dozens of them, taken at various locations over several years. These are all from federal investigations, she said. None of it ever makes it into official reports because the moment someone mentions Bigfoot or Sasquatch, the case gets closed with insufficient evidence or witness unreliable. But the pattern is real, Officer Vance. Something is happening in these mountains. Why are you telling me this? Because I think you know more than you're saying. I've read your reports on both incidents. They're accurate and professional, but there are gaps. Details that don't quite add up, and I think you left those gaps intentionally. She was right, of course, but I couldn't tell her that without betraying the trust that Richard Peterson and those creatures had placed in me. Agent Martinez, if I knew something that could help your investigation, I'd tell you. But all I have are my official reports and my observations as a patrol officer. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. Okay. But if that changes, if you ever decide there's something you need to share, call me. She handed me her card. Because I think whatever's out there, it's trying to tell us something important, and we're running out of time to listen. After she left, I sat in my patrol car looking at her card and thinking about what she'd said running out of time. The same urgency I'd heard from Richard, from David Lyle, from the creatures themselves. That night, I drove back to milepost 132. It had been over a year since I'd first met Richard Peterson there, since I'd walked into those woods and had my understanding of reality fundamentally altered. The area looked different now, recovery from the fire beginning to show in new growth and resilient vegetation. I parked and walked to the forest edge. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of golden purple. I stood there for a long moment, feeling foolish, then spoke aloud to the empty forest. I don't know if you can hear me. I don't know if you're even still in this area, but if you are, I need you to understand something. People are starting to pay attention. Federal investigators are asking questions, and I can't protect you if I don't know what you're trying to tell us. Silence. Just the wind through the trees and the distant sound of the Skagit River. I turned to walk back to my car, feeling like an idiot for talking to the woods. But then I heard it. That vocalization. Quiet, distant, but unmistakable. And it wasn't just one. It was multiple voices, calling to each other through the trees in that strange, almost language I'd heard twice before. I turned back to the forest and saw movement in the gathering darkness. Not close, maybe 100 yards away, but visible. A tall figure standing among the trees, watching. "I'm Michael Vance," I called out. "I helped Richard. I helped David. I want to understand what you're trying to tell us." The figure didn't approach, but it didn't leave either. And then, slowly, it raised one long arm and pointed. Not at me, not at the forest, at the mountains to the east. The same mountains that Richard's map had marked. The same mountains that had burned. I understood then. It wasn't about the past fire. It was about the next one. About fires and disasters that were coming. That these creatures could sense with senses we didn't have. That they were desperately trying to warn us about. "When?" I called out. "When is it coming?" The figure lowered its arm. And then it did something I hadn't expected. It held up one hand, fingers spread. 5, then pointed at me, then at the mountains again. 5. 5. What? 5 years? 5 months? 5 disasters? Before I could ask for clarification, the figure turned and walked deeper into the forest, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there for another hour, hoping it would return, but I was alone again. I drove back to the detachment and pulled out Agent Martinez's card. I stared at it for a long time, weighing options. If I told her what I'd just seen, what I'd experienced over the past year, would she believe me? Would she use the information to help? Or would she bring unwanted attention to creatures that had spent thousands of years successfully avoiding humans? In the end, I didn't call her. Not yet. But I kept her card in my wallet, right next to Richard's folded map, 2 pieces of evidence of a reality that most people would never believe. Over the next few months, I started paying more attention to environmental reports. Seismic activity in the Cascades, climate patterns, forest health assessments. And I began to see what the creatures had been trying to show David Lyle, what they'd been trying to tell Richard Peterson. The Pacific Northwest was entering a period of increased geological and environmental instability. Minor earthquakes were becoming more frequent. Drought cycles were getting more severe. Forest fires were larger and more destructive each year. Were these creatures, with their deep connection to the land and their extended lifespans, able to sense these patterns earlier than our instruments could detect them? Were they trying to warn us about a series of coming disasters that would reshape the region? I wanted to dismiss it as coincidence or paranoia, but I kept thinking about that fire, about how they'd known exactly where it would start before any instrument or expert had predicted it. In September of 1997, I requested a meeting with the Forest Service supervisor again. I told him I'd been studying fire patterns and climate data, and I believed the region was entering a period of elevated risk. I suggested increased monitoring and proactive fire prevention measures. He thanked me for my concern and reminded me again that I was a highway patrol officer, not a climate scientist. But this time, I didn't leave it at that. I wrote a formal letter to the State Emergency Management Office, outlining my concerns and recommending increased disaster preparedness for the Route 20 corridor. I sent copies to the county sheriff's office, to search and rescue coordinators, to anyone who might actually have the authority to do something. Most of them thanked me politely and filed my letter away, but a few took it seriously. The county emergency coordinator used my letter as justification to apply for federal grants to update evacuation plans and communication systems. Search and Rescue used it to justify increased training exercises in the area. It wasn't much, but it was something. If disaster came, maybe we'd be slightly more prepared than we would have been otherwise. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to save lives, which was what those creatures wanted all along. In December of 1997, Agent Martinez contacted me again. She'd been promoted, assigned to a new unit focused on environmental threats and disaster prediction. She wanted to know if I had any updates on the unusual incidents in the North Cascades. I met her at the same trailhead parking lot. Snow was falling lightly, coating the mountains in fresh white. Agent Martinez, I need to ask you something. If I told you I believed there were unknown hominids living in these mountains, hominids that appear to have the ability to predict natural disasters, would you think I was crazy? She looked at me steadily. Officer Vance, I've seen things in my investigations that I can't explain. Footprints that don't match any known primate. Witnesses who describe beings that display complex behavior and apparent intelligence, audio recordings of vocalizations that sound almost like language. So no, I wouldn't think you're crazy. I think you're one of the few people willing to acknowledge what the evidence suggests. They're real, I said quietly. I've seen them, talked to people they've protected, and they're trying to warn us about something big, something they can sense that we can't measure yet. What kind of something? I don't know exactly. Fires, earthquakes, disasters, a series of events that will hit the Pacific Northwest harder than anything in modern history. They've lived through these cycles before. They know the warning signs, and they're trying to give us time to prepare. She was quiet for a long moment, snow accumulating on her shoulders. Can you prove any of this? No, that's the problem. Everything I have is anecdotal or circumstantial. But Agent Martinez, I've been a trooper for 15 years. I know the difference between a reliable witness and someone experiencing a delusion. And every person who's encountered these creatures comes back with the same message: they're trying to help us. Then help me help them, she said. I can't officially investigate Sasquatch sightings without being laughed out of the Bureau, but I can investigate patterns of seismic activity, climate change impacts on forests, and disaster preparedness gaps. If you can give me data, information, anything that connects to natural disasters, I can work with that. Over the next hour, we sat in her car, and I shared everything I felt I could share without betraying specific trust. The pattern of disappearances and reappearances, the warnings about fires and earthquakes, the map Richard had given me, though I didn't explain its origin. She took notes, asked intelligent questions, and never once suggested I was imagining things or exaggerating. When we finished, she looked at the map for a long time. "This is good work," she said finally. "This is the kind of pattern analysis that could actually help prepare communities. Would you be willing to consult on a disaster preparedness study? Not officially, just as a local expert who knows the area and has insights into historical patterns. If it helps people, yes, it will. And Officer Vance, thank you for taking this seriously, for being willing to share what you know, even though it makes you sound crazy. Not many people would do that." As I drove home that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Maybe we couldn't prove the creatures existed. Maybe we couldn't convince the world to take their warnings seriously. But we could prepare. We could build better evacuation plans, train more search and rescue volunteers, create early warning systems. And when the disasters came, and I was increasingly certain they would come, maybe we could save lives. That's what they wanted. Not recognition, not proof of their existence. Just for humans to be ready when the earth itself started to shift and change. I thought about that figure in the forest, raising 5 fingers. 5 years, I hoped. 5 years to prepare before whatever they'd sensed came to pass. I intended to use every one of those years as effectively as I could, because I'd been given a gift that night at milepost 132. The gift of knowledge, of warning, of time, and I wasn't going to waste it. 5 years. That's how much time we had, though I didn't know it then with certainty. 5 years to prepare for what those creatures had sensed coming. 5 years that I spent walking a tightrope between belief and credibility, between protecting their secret and protecting the people I'd sworn to serve. The years between 1997 and 2002 were some of the most purposeful of my career. Working with Agent Martinez and her growing network of researchers and emergency management professionals, I helped develop comprehensive disaster response protocols for the North Cascades region. We disguised it as routine preparedness work, improvements to systems that were outdated anyway. Nobody needed to know that we were preparing for specific disasters that hadn't been predicted by any conventional science. They just needed to be ready when those disasters came. In March of 2001, the first major piece fell into place. A 6.8 magnitude earthquake hit the Seattle area, centered under Olympia. It was the strongest earthquake to hit the region in 50 years, causing widespread damage and miraculously only one death. Despite the chaos, I was off duty when it hit, felt my house in Marble Mount shake for nearly a minute, pictures falling from walls and dishes crashing in the kit Leo. When it was over, I stood in my doorway looking toward the mountains, and I thought about David Lyle's warnings about earthquakes, about Mount Rainier in Seattle, and water. The earthquake happened in March, 5 years and 5 months after that night at milepost 132, when the creature had held up 5 fingers. Agent Martinez called me that evening. "You knew," she said without preamble. Or they knew. This is what they were warning about. "This is just the beginning," I said. "That's what I'm afraid of." The earthquake changed things suddenly. Disaster preparedness wasn't a fringe concern anymore. Funding flowed into emergency management programs. Evacuation routes were improved. Building codes were updated. All the groundwork we'd laid over the previous 5 years was now being taken seriously, but I knew the earthquakes were just part of the pattern. The fires would come too. They always did. In the summer of 2002, the Pacific Northwest experienced one of the driest seasons on record. By July, fire danger was rated extreme across the entire Cascade Range. And I kept thinking about that map Richard had given me 7 years earlier, about how precisely the creatures had predicted where the 1996 fire would start. I spent as much time as I could that summer patrolling the remote sections of Route 20, watching the forests, looking for signs. Other troopers thought I was obsessed, taking too much overtime, unable to let go of the job. They weren't entirely wrong. On August 10th, I was parked at a pullout near Ross Lake, monitoring traffic and thinking about requesting early retirement. I was 49 years old, had given nearly 2 decades to the State Patrol, and I was tired. Tired of knowing things I couldn't fully explain, tired of carrying secrets, tired of waiting for disasters I couldn't prevent. That's when I saw him. Richard Peterson. It had been 6 years since I'd last seen him at that diner in Concrete. He was older now, gray starting to show in his hair, but I recognized him immediately. He was standing at the edge of the trees, just visible from the highway, watching me. I pulled over and got out. "Richard?" He nodded, didn't approach the patrol car. "They sent me to find you. We don't have much time." "Time for what?" "The fire. The one they warned us about 7 years ago. It's starting tonight, multiple ignition points across the Cascades. Lightning strikes from a dry storm that's forming now. It's going to be worse than anything you've seen before." "How do you know?" "Because I've been with them, Mike. On and off for the past 7 years. They found me in Bellingham, asked me to be a liaison. To learn their language, understand their warnings, help translate. I'm the bridge between their world and ours, and right now, they need you to be ready." "Ready for what?" "To save lives. The fires are going to move fast, faster than anyone expects. Multiple communities are going to be in danger. And when the evacuation orders come, there's not going to be enough time unless someone who knows these roads, who understands the timing, is positioned to help." "Where are they?" "Can I talk to them?" Richard shook his head. "They're already leaving, heading north to Canada, to safer forests. But before they go, they wanted you to know. They wanted to thank you for believing, for preparing, and they wanted to give you this." He handed me a piece of bark, smooth and flat, with marks carved into it. A map more detailed than the one from before. Multiple points marked with symbols I now recognized as fire ignition sites. Dates and times marked with a system that approximated our calendar. "Tonight," Richard said. "The storms hit after dark. By midnight, there will be fires in 8 locations. By dawn, some of them will merge. By the end of the week, this will be the largest fire complex the Cascades have seen in a century." I can't evacuate communities based on a piece of bark and a warning from Bigfoot, Richard. I'll lose my job, my credibility, everything. You don't have to tell anyone where the information came from. Just trust your instincts. Monitor the weather, position yourself where you can respond quickly, and when the fires start, be the first one calling for evacuations. That's all they're asking. He turned to leave, then paused. Mike, they asked me to tell you something else. They said you've honored the trust they placed in you. You've kept their secret while still finding ways to help, and they want you to know that no matter what happens, no matter what anyone else believes, they see you as a friend. Richard disappeared into the trees, and I stood there holding that piece of bark, knowing that in a few hours, my entire world was going to change. I spent the rest of the afternoon and early evening positioning myself strategically, monitoring weather reports, and discreetly contacting the emergency management coordinator for the county. I told her my instincts were screaming that tonight was going to be bad for fires, that she should consider having evacuation plans ready to implement on short notice. She trusted me enough by then to take me seriously. "I'll put everyone on standby," she said. "If anything pops up, we'll be ready to move." The storm hit around 9 p.m. dry lightning, no rain, winds gusting to 40 miles per hour. Perfect conditions for disaster. I watched from a high point on Route 20 as lightning strikes lit up the mountains in multiple locations, each flash a potential ignition. By 10 p.m., the first fire reports were coming in. By midnight, there were 6 confirmed fires burning across the North Cascades. By 2 a.m., evacuation orders were being issued for several small communities in the path of the fast-moving flames. I spent the next 72 hours in my patrol car, functioning on coffee and adrenaline, helping coordinate evacuations and traffic control. The fires moved exactly as Richard's bark map had indicated, merging into massive complexes that consumed hundreds of thousands of acres. But because we'd been prepared, because the evacuation infrastructure was in place and we'd responded immediately, everyone got out. Communities were lost, homes burned, but not a single life was taken by the flames. When it was finally over, when the fires were contained and the smoke began to clear, the incident commanders praised the speed and efficiency of the evacuation response. They credited improved planning, better communication systems, and what they called exceptional situational awareness from local law enforcement. Nobody asked how I'd known to be positioned exactly where I needed to be. Nobody questioned why I'd had evacuation plans ready before the first flames were visible. They were just grateful it had worked. But I knew, and Richard knew, and somewhere in the forests of British Columbia, a group of creatures that shouldn't exist knew that their warning had been heard and heeded. 2 weeks after the fires, I found a message waiting at the detachment. A simple manila envelope with my name on it, no return address. Inside was a photograph, recent based on the development date stamp. It showed a family. 2 adults, 2 younger ones, standing among the trees in what looked like pristine old-growth forest. Their faces were turned toward the camera, and though the image was slightly blurred, they'd moved, or the photographer's hand had shaken. I could see them clearly enough. They looked peaceful, safe. And one of them, the larger of the 2 adults, had one massive hand raised in what could only be interpreted as a gesture of farewell or acknowledgement. On the back of the photo, in handwriting I recognized as Richard's, were 3 words: "They are safe." I put the photograph in my safe deposit box along with the maps and my written accounts of everything that had happened, evidence that no one would believe, proof that would convince no one, but truth nonetheless. A month later, I submitted my retirement paperwork. I'd served for 19 years, could claim a partial pension, and I was done. Not because I didn't love the job anymore, but because I'd accomplished what I needed to accomplish. I'd honored the trust those creatures had placed in me. I'd used the warnings they'd given me to save lives, and now it was time for someone else to keep watch. On my last day of patrol, October 17th, 2002, exactly 7 years after that first encounter at milepost 132, I drove the entire length of Route 21 final time. I stopped at all my old familiar pullouts, took in the views of the mountains I'd protected and patrolled for nearly 2 decades. At milepost 132, I stopped and walked to the edge of the forest. The trees had grown back from the 1996 fire, young and green and vibrant life returning, as it always did. "Thank you," I said to the empty woods, "for trusting me, for trying to save us from ourselves. I hope you find peace in your new home." The wind moved through the trees, and for just a moment, I thought I heard that vocalization one last time. Low, resonant, carrying a tone that might have been acknowledgement or might have been goodbye. I returned to my patrol car and drove away from Route 20 for the last time as a Washington State Trooper. But the story didn't quite end there. In 2008, Agent Kristen Martinez published a comprehensive study on disaster preparedness and early warning systems in the Pacific Northwest. It became a model for emergency management programs across the country. She dedicated it to the unnamed sources and witnesses whose observations and insights made this research possible. In 2010, Richard Peterson published a book under a pseudonym about climate change and forest management. It became a minor bestseller in environmental circles. There was a chapter about listening to the wisdom of the land itself, about signs and warnings that conventional science might miss. He never mentioned Sasquatch by name, but those who knew the truth could read between the lines. And me, I became a fishing guide, taking tourists into the backcountry of the North Cascades, showing them the beauty of the forests, teaching them about respecting wilderness. I never took clients into certain areas, places I knew held secrets that deserved to remain hidden, and in 2015, I was hiking alone in a remote area of the North Cascades, well off any established trail, when I found a stack of stones. Deliberately placed, clearly arranged by intelligent hands, next to it was a stick propped against a tree pointing north. An invitation. A direction. A message. I didn't follow it. Some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries. Some friendships are better honored by respecting boundaries than by crossing them. But I left something of my own. A carefully arranged stack of stones in response, a gesture of acknowledgement and respect, and a small token, something that meant nothing to anyone else but that they might recognize. My old state patrol badge, the one I'd worn the night I first met them. When I returned a month later, both the badge and the stick were gone. But there was something new. A perfect handprint in the mud beside the creek. Massive, unmistakable. A farewell or a confirmation that the message had been received. I'm 70 years old now. Writing this account in 2023, most people would dismiss everything I've described as the delusions of an aging man. Stories told by someone who spent too much time alone in the woods, and maybe they're right. Maybe I did imagine all of it, create an elaborate fantasy to make sense of random events and ordinary circumstances. But I have the photographs. I have the maps. I have the testimonies of Richard Peterson and David Lyle and others who encountered them and came back changed. I have the scars on my conscience from all the times I lied in official reports to protect their secret. And I have this. Every prediction they made came true. Every warning was accurate. Every disaster they sensed came to pass. And because I listened, because I prepared, lives were saved. That's not delusion. That's not fantasy. That's evidence of something we don't understand. Something that challenges our assumptions about who and what inhabits the wilderness areas we think we've explored and mapped and conquered. There are creatures in the forests of the Pacific Northwest that have lived there for thousands of years. They're intelligent, compassionate, and deeply connected to the land in ways we've forgotten or never knew. They watch us, avoid us most of the time. But occasionally, rarely, they reach out. They try to warn us. They try to help us. Despite everything we've done to their habitat, despite hunting them and mocking them and treating them like myths, they still care enough about us to warn us when disaster approaches. I was lucky enough, or perhaps cursed enough, to be someone they trusted with that warning, and I've spent the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that trust. If you're reading this and you think I'm crazy, that's okay. I understand. But if you're reading this and something in the story resonates, if you've had your own encounter in the deep woods, if you've seen things that shouldn't exist but do, then you know I'm telling the truth. They're real. They're still out there. And they're still trying to help us, even when we don't deserve it. All we have to do is listen and believe. And when the next warning comes, and it will come, because the Earth's cycles don't stop, disasters don't cease, I hope there's someone like me ready to hear it. Someone willing to cross the boundary between what we know and what we've yet to understand. Someone brave enough to trust creatures that exist in the margins of our maps and the edges of our certainty, because the forests hold secrets, and some of those secrets are trying very hard to keep us alive. I just hope we're wise enough to listen before it's too late.